I did one study looking at over 1 million nonprofit tax returns over a 6-year period, and we were trying to see what predicts long-term contributions growth. Well, it turns out that organizations that only receive gifts of cash, those organizations over the 5-year period, on average, had their contributions grow a total of 11% over 5 years. Organizations that both at the beginning and at the end also received shares of stock as gifts, their average growth rate was not 11%, it was 66%.
Welcome, Russell. You have published a number of books, plus, you've done a ton of research. I was reading 75 research papers. So I thought you would be the perfect guest to come and talk to us about some myths and science behind fundraising.
Great. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Good, because we're going to dive right into the deep end.
Okay.
And that's with one of those myths around how tax receipts and tax receipts don't matter. So why are we even continuing to mention them?
Yeah. So, this is an interesting conversation that comes up, and it is a challenge because I understand the attraction of the message that says, hey, donors are not motivated by charitable deductions. They're not motivated by tax benefits, so therefore don't talk about them. That is such an attractive message for fundraisers because it means they don't need to learn anything, right? And hey, having to learn tax law, charitable tax law, that is not the favorite thing for most fundraisers. So I understand the real attraction for this message. Here's the problem. It misunderstands both the process and the data on this. So, what do I mean by that? Saying that the tax benefits aren't the motivation for the donor is true, but also irrelevant because a gift happens at the intersection of motivation and cost. And it turns out that if we get tax benefits and we learn how to help the donors to maximize those tax benefits, it reduces the cost of the donor having the impact that they want to have. The very first thing you learn in Economics 101 is that price matters. And in this case, what impacts the price of that charitable giving is the tax benefits. Now, we see this in a lot of different ways. Of course, we can look at national research and we can see in the data how much it matters. For any sort of data wonky folks that are listening, it's in part because with our tax system, income goes up $1 at a time, but the tax brackets break at certain points. And so that's where we get differences in the value of a tax deduction, and we can separate out those two factors and see just how powerful the tax benefits are. There's other ways we could do this. For example, in some of my research, we randomly assign people to one of two descriptions of a gift. One references the tax benefits and one doesn't. Hey, the one referencing the tax benefits, people are much more interested in. Here's the problem. You'll get an organization, maybe even a consulting firm that says, hey, we want to learn why people give. And so they'll send out a survey that says, why do you give? And there'll be options on, I give because, I want to change the world because of my values, because that's how I was brought up. And then one of the options will be, I give because I want tax benefits. And it turns out nobody checks that box. And so they get the results back and they say, oh, well, then don't talk about tax benefits. Look, this is a common issue we have in social science research that is a bias that we see in responses. If you ask people for their motivations, you're going to get the most socially approved motivations. And so, of course, people aren't going to check that box. It does not mean that these aren't important issues. And so, again, it's this notion that's super attractive. It kind of makes life easier for fundraisers, but it's just not true. Tax benefits do matter. They do have a substantial and significant effect on donations and on what donors do, especially when it comes to the donors of capacity that have the propensity or have the possibility of really making a big impact at your organization. And we see that in the data as well. As capacity increases, the focus on the tax benefits also increases. So, just some good reasons to keep that in mind. And by the way, if you want to learn about all of these sort of deep dive details on all the tax benefits from charitable giving and planned giving and major gifts of assets, you just go to YouTube, type in Russell James Planned Giving. I've got 65 short animated videos there for free. They're about 10 to 15 minutes a piece. If you suffer through one a day, give that a couple months and you'll be an expert on the topic.
We're gonna link your channel in the video description as well, because that is a great resource. So I am technically Canadian, although I
Hmm.
spend most of my time, well, half because I can't spend all my time in the US. And our tax laws are so different in a lot of
Sure.
ways
Yeah.
from what they are down in the States.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Even as a Canadian, I do donate to American charities, but there's absolutely no tax benefit. So I
Right.
find myself donating to those that provide those other reasons that
Hmm.
that they mean something to me and I see the
Yeah.
impact that they're making. But yeah, I
Yeah.
like the tax receipt.
Yeah, it is a reality that tax benefits aren't the motivation, but price still matters, right?
Yep.
And so it is that combination of price and motivation that leads to ultimately making a gift, which is what we're interested in.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about messaging because there is a I've seen it a lot where organizations focus on the disaster or they desperately need these funds. So what is your take on that myth that we should be out there talking about how dire everything is?
Yeah, so it's really important to keep this in mind because it is certainly the case, and no surprise, that if you send a message of organizational desperation, that's going to get you the $50 gift today. The problem is it will do so at the cost of the major life investment gift tomorrow. In other words, people don't make these major life investment gifts to unstable organizations. Part of the attraction is that I want to make this gift because it can make an impact that will last, in many cases, last beyond my own life. And that kind of permanence, that's what attracts these large life investment gifts. So the problem is if you are giving a message of organizational desperation, organizational instability, that is just going to exclude you from those kinds of large gifts. And so often what happens is that organizations can kind of get caught in this desperation cycle where we need something desperately, we communicate that desperation to donors, the donors respond to that desperation with a small pocket change gift. And so it gets us through the next month or the next quarter. But we never somehow seem to get those major kind of life investment gifts that we see other organizations getting that would really move the needle on the kind of impact that we make. And that's the reason for it. Now, there are ways that we can communicate need without communicating organizational instability. So, for example, there might be a situation that has desperate need, or a beneficiary or beneficiary group or scenario or situation in which there is desperate need without communicating that the organization itself is unstable or has a need. Otherwise, it may close the doors. So we can talk about immediacy and desperate need, but it's got to be clear that it is not the organization that is at risk. In the same way, there might be some natural disaster, and maybe the Red Cross is saying, "Hey, support now because of this natural disaster," but the Red Cross is not communicating that support now. Otherwise, our organization will have to close its doors. So again, it's that difference between don't communicate organizational instability because it will work today for that small pocket change gift, but it's really expensive because it really knocks you out from those large life investment gifts.
Mm. We had talked a little bit before we started recording about the pocket change gifts versus
Mm,
the wealth gifts, those
right.
coming from high value donors.
Hmm.
And I had mentioned that a lot of our subscribers are smaller grassroots organizations. So what would you say to them about, because we're so focused on these pocket change gifts, and I don't see a lot of small grassroots organizations looking at their circles and looking at some of those life-changing gifts.
Yeah, so that is a substantial difference, and it's even a difference in psychology. That when we are making the typical gifts, these are pocket change gifts, they're disposable income gifts, and so our reference point, for example, is other things we spend cash on, right? What we just spend at Starbucks, and so when that's our reference point, a large gift seems completely out of place. Like, if our reference point is what we spend at Starbucks, $10,000 or $100,000, well, that makes no sense. If, however, we can start having conversations about assets and gifts of assets, that's one way to get into this conversation about wealth sharing, which psychologically reframes the gift because now the reference point is not what I just spent at Starbucks. The reference point is the wealth category. Let me give you an example. So I might mention something like this that, many folks who support our organization like to make a gift from assets, say appreciated stock, because if they make that kind of a gift, they actually get a double tax benefit. It comes with the same size of deduction as if you make a gift of cash, but you also get to wipe out all the capital gains taxes that you would have had to have paid on that appreciation. And in fact, you don't even need to change your portfolio. Let's say you've got some shares of Apple stock that have gone up. Instead of giving us the cash, just give us those old shares of Apple stock. Use your cash to buy brand new shares of Apple stock. You can do this in the same day at the same moment. It doesn't change your portfolio, but since you just bought those new shares, there's no capital gain in them. You've wiped that out. Now, on the one hand, as a financial advisor, this is helpful for the donor, right? The fact that they get this double tax benefit, it's a wonderful thing to do. On the other hand, from a fundraising perspective, what happens is the size of that gift can get dramatically larger because now when I start making a gift from my stock portfolio, what's my reference point? Well, it's my stock portfolio, it's my wealth holdings. So now a very large gift all of a sudden seems pretty reasonable. It seems relatively small. And in fact, we see this in a number of different ways in the data. Just to give you one quick example, I did one study looking at over 1 million nonprofit tax returns over a 6 year period, and we were trying to see what predicts long term contributions growth. Well, it turns out that organizations that only receive gifts of cash, so no securities, no real estate, no other kinds, just cash, those organizations over the 5 year period, on average, had their contributions grow a total of 11% over 5 years, identical to the inflation rate over those 5 years. Organizations that both at the beginning and at the end also received shares of stock as gifts, their average growth rate was not 11%, it was 66%. So it was a six-fold increase in long-term contributions growth from the organizations that were consistently receiving gifts of non-cash assets like stocks. Similar effect if it was something like real estate. So the whole point is there that we see this kind of impact in terms of long-term contributions growth whenever we can shift donors to thinking about their wealth. And one last way we can shift donors to thinking about their wealth, you may not have thought about this, but it is actually to mention the gift in a will. Many people who support this organization like to include us with a gift in a will so that their support continues on after their life. Now, when a person adds a charitable gift in a will, notice that is not a gift of disposable income sharing. That is wealth sharing because it's a share of the estate. And what we see from national data when we look at adults 50 and above that add a charitable component into their estate plan for the first time, their current giving in the 2, 4, 6, and 8 years following that actually goes up 77%. And it's sustained at that higher level all throughout that kind of future period. So their behavior changes after they add charity to their estate plan. In part, I think, because all of a sudden their wealth becomes donation relevant. So, having these wealth conversations of learning a bit more about if you've got a generous donor, thank you so much for supporting us as much as you have done. Tell me a little bit about what makes it possible for you to do that. Learn a little bit about their story. Is it perhaps that they are in some form of a business? Maybe they have a business interest or real estate, and they have real estate interest, or wherever it might be. We want to learn about what is that background, what's going on today, and then ultimately to ask about if they have any future plans, because ultimately there's only places it can go. They're either going to sell it or they're going to die with it. If they sell it, great time for charitable planning. Any of that that's made as a donation before the sale avoids all those capital gains taxes. Great time to make a gift. And any of it that ends up in the estate, well, we can talk about charitable estate planning in that space. So it's just the notion of being able to have conversations about wealth, to get to the wealth sharing conversation. And again, that can be as simple as, something like, for folks 70 and a half or older, they can make direct transfers from their IRA or IRA rollover. If they got a 401k or something like that, just change it to an IRA rollover. They can make gifts directly from that. They've never had to pay income taxes on that money. And now they never will have to pay income taxes on that money because it comes directly to the charitable organization. And by the way, for people of any age, if they name our organization as a beneficiary for part of that account, any of that money that goes to family members, they've got to pay income taxes on it. But any of it that comes to us, no income taxes. So it's really smart planning. Well, notice what I've been doing in there. One, I'm providing value or benefit to the donors by, hey, here's an idea, here's an idea, here's another idea. But notice I'm having wealth conversations. I'm having asset sharing conversations. And now we're starting to shift into that donor mindset of their assets becoming donation relevant, to move them beyond just this being a cash decision, a pocket change decision. Now, of course, if you're thinking about this and you're totally freaked out by the idea of getting a gift of an asset like a share of stock or real estate or something else, like, I couldn't even deal with that. I wouldn't know where to begin. Don't worry about it because there are donor advised funds that will actually walk through that process with the donor. And so that ultimately you just end up getting a check at the end. So if you don't want to take the asset directly because it's too complicated, then they can simply give it to the donor advised fund. the donor advised fund sells it, and then they send the cash out to your organization. But again, you still want to have these conversations about asset sharing, because it can be so powerful for the size of gift that seems reasonable to the donor because it changes that reference point for their donation.
Um, and you don't have to be a big organization to do this. So I'm going to share a quick story.
Yes.
My daughter bought a ranch. Her house burned down. But the local volunteer fire department came out, and then all the community, and then the churches, and everybody supported her. So now she's redoing her will, and she's leaving 1% of her estate to the volunteer fire department, which is a nonprofit organization in her town.
Mhm.
And because she's done that, she's donating to them on a more regular basis. So my other question was, and I think this is a myth, that we should just focus on older donors when it comes to plan giving. So what's your thoughts on the age around
Yeah.
estates and will planning and wealth planning?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you kind of a mixed response on that,
Okay.
so for our younger donors, we want to get them to include a gift in their plan for our organization, but actually not because we're trying to generate the estate gifts. We want to get into the plan because it increases that sense of connection with us. I mean, they're treating us like a family member, right? When we go in that plan, but also they are starting to think about wealth sharing with our organization. And statistically, we know that that is going to have an impact on their current giving, where that tends to go up. So we definitely want to get in the plan early. We want to get in the plan with younger donors, but oddly enough, not because of the estate gift, because the estate gift itself, well, that's like 40 years later or 30 years later, that sort of thing. So it's not really the motivation. And also, the case is that there is a lot of fluidity in the charitable component of an estate plan. And in particular, and so this is where I'm going to go to the opposite end of the spectrum, in particular, there's an enormous amount of fluidity in the charitable component of an estate plan in the last 3 to 5 years of life. Very commonly, new planning takes place. Somebody gets a negative diagnosis, different things that can happen at that point. And what we see is that that's when a lot of charitable components are added, dropped, changed. There's more adding than dropping, but just a lot of fluidity. Now, here's why this is important, because charities often do exactly the wrong thing in this space. And let me explain why. When we look at the data on people who actually transferred dollars to charity at the end of life, and if we go back, say, 20 years before they died, they were substantial donors. About 70% of them were giving $500 or more. They were very likely to be volunteers. About a quarter of them were doing that. But then as we approach those last 3 to 5 years of life, what happens? The likelihood that there's still going to be donors goes down and down and down until most of me aren't donors in those last few years. And certainly volunteering just kind of falls off a cliff. Well, the problem is that it is most likely that the document that will actually control those assets is going to be signed in those last 3 to 5 years of life. That last one is the only one that sort of matters in terms of transferring the estate. And what do our charities do? They communicate based upon recency of donation, which means they are guaranteeing that they're going to go radio silent right at that critical moment for folks who are actually going to be transferring dollars to charity at the end of life. So, number one recommendation on the opposite end of the spectrum is, if you have people who have a history of connection with your organization, once they reach a magic age, let's call it 75, you just don't ever stop communicating with them, right? Whatever that is, the newsletter, whatever standard kind of communications you get, it stays permanent in your communication in those older years because we know that the largest gift that somebody's going to leave you is going to be that estate gift. And we also know that the typical behavior of those estate donors is to stop giving during those last few years of life when the actual final document is going to be signed. So there's kind of a two-part recommendation on hey, great to get in the plan early, but also don't forget your oldest friends.
I think you just busted one of the biggest myths, and that is that plan giving is only for large organizations. So again, I'm going to list your YouTube channel in the video description so that our viewers can go in and learn a little bit more. And you mentioned donor advised funds, and I'm going to list your books. I'm going to list your books as well. Yeah.
And yeah, so actually, I share all my stuff for free. If somebody connects with me on LinkedIn, I'll send you PDFs of all my books, connections to all my videos, slide shares, all of that, or encouragegenerosity.com has several of them there as well.
Oh, that's perfect. All right. Well, is there anything that we missed? Anything that you want to say in closing?
No, just a great opportunity to share. And I'm always interested if folks have questions or things they run into or want to share a story, please just let me know. Always interested in what's working well or not working at all. Both of those things as a researcher are equally interesting to me. So appreciate the opportunity just to share a few ideas.
Okay. Thank you, Russell.